Hello, I'm Allan Bonner, and welcome to At Issue. Remember when the greatest enemy to the Western world was the Soviet Union? The communist country that was strong, ambitious, with nuclear weapons, and a larger standing army than our side had? You'll also remember the joy that was felt with the arrival of Gorbachev, Glasnost, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, the West won the Cold War, and the threat of nuclear confrontation was history. Then the West found new adversaries. The former Soviet Union floundered in economic ruin and personal hardship. But history can move quickly. Russia, a big chunk of the former Soviet Union, may be taking a new role in the world. Its economy is booming thanks to the energy sector. Its army has modernized and is growing. And its public statements sound a lot like the language of the Cold War. In fact, there are those who think that Vladimir Putin's Russia may eclipse the old Soviet Union. Could Russia be a world leader? Late 80s, Gorbachev is in power. The Communist Party agrees to allow some kind of a private sector and some kind of free-ish elections. Is this the turning point? I mean, I know things can be evolutionary, not revolutionary, but was this a very important turning point?
Yes, I would say that 1988, really, the party conference in the summer of 1988 is a crucial turn because Gorbachev persuades the party to take the path of reforms, which could be described as radical, open-ended, things like, okay, people will be now electing their own representatives, or we are really making a big step toward a market economy. By the way, by that time, the Cold War was already declared over by Reagan and Gorbachev. So step number one was, let's deal with Soviet-American relations. So mission accomplished. We have the Cold War over. Reagan recognized being in the Kremlin, kissing the babies there, and stuff like that.
And we've got, by about this time, the first elections in 72 years, roughly, where there are two names on the ballot, and it's actually, the result is going to mean something. Describe that for me. I mean, what did it feel like in the Soviet Union to have that change?
Listen, I took my son to the polling station, right? And I thought it was a great solemn moment, and my son was 10 years old, and so we look at the ballot, we see several names there, right? And one of the names was Yeltsin, and I was voting for Yeltsin. I'm showing the ballot to him and say, see, this is a solemn moment in our life because we are now, this is an election where we choose, so we cross out those who we do not support, and the one that we support, we drop that ballot and say, and he was not impressed. So we walked out.
Your 10-year-old?
Oh, 10. It was a very bright young man. I said, hey, you know, do you realize how historic it is? He said, Dad, I don't get it. I say, well, you know, this is an election where we choose between opposing candidates. He said, Dad, if it's otherwise, how can it be an election? And I said, listen, I spent my lifetime voting in elections where there was only one candidate at the ballot. He could not believe it.
You're in Moscow.
Yeah.
And
so he already takes for granted democratic process, which it took me half of my lifetime to achieve. See?
All right, special moment for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
1991 feels to me like the last vestige of the old guard, when some old Soviet guards literally kidnap Gorbachev at his summer residence, hold him for 3 days. Marvelous moment in Canada. Our foreign minister, Barbara McDougall, says, well, maybe we'll try to do business with these new guys or whoever replaces them. And the Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, says, I want to know if he's safe, where his family is, and such. Is that the last vestige of the old communist regime?
The putsch, well, I guess it was one more attempt on the part of the really old guard to keep the old system intact, especially the Soviet Union. But it was so degenerated by then that they weren't even able to organize, you know, a real coup. I mean, old-fashioned coup with all the things that an old-fashioned coup requires. It was just too late.
Gentlemen, we're into the Putin era, 1999, and I'm reminded of the Dr. Zhivago question, where a confused citizen says, this man Lenin, is he going to be the new czar? Well, is Putin the new czar? What is he?
Well, first the person who reintroduced government back to Russia, and that's why probably the Russians are so very fond of him after the decade of Yeltsin and, you know, this weak government president who is sick and drunk and issues decrees that nobody pays any attention to. all the calamities that Sergei described. He is the man who says, well, you know, this is pretty much over. If we keep going, then the Russian Federation will disintegrate. We have to, I guess, save Russia. And the best way to do it is to introduce government back to Russia. I mean, Russians are people who like to have a strong government that decides about their lives. Maybe not as much as, you know, the Soviet governments wanted to and did decide, but nevertheless.
I think Putin does not see himself as an evil dictator. I think he regards himself as someone who is returning glory to Russia, which explains his approval ratings 2000 to 2008, and why he's been able to maintain his hold on power. What we don't understand in the West is the extent that the Russians were insulted by having to be bailed out by the West in 1998. And so what is Putin doing today? Well, he's asserting Russian authority. He's asserting Russian authority when he regards it as threatened in Georgia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. He's attempting to assert Russian authority in the Ukraine. What is going to be interesting is whether he is able to take a situation like Georgia or what's currently happening in the Ukraine and install, you know, a puppet, someone who he can control.
What makes you think he wants?
Well, so, I mean,
to have a puppet in Ukraine. I see no evidence that the Russians can imagine that they can put a puppet in charge of Ukraine.
Well, not a. Well, but you don't see it. I mean, certainly that explains
let's talk about why this is. Let's talk about why this is important to people at home. You've got the oil in the Caspian Sea feeding the EU across Georgia. You've got Putin recognizing South Ossetia and against Georgia's wishes. You've got America putting, if not weapons, the missile defense shield very close to Russia's borders. This really feels like the old Cuban Missile Crisis or something, if you look at it that way. Am I overreacting?
No, I think that you are emphasizing a very dangerous trend that is unfolding right in front of our eyes. And that's why people say, is it another Cold War? As if the Cold War is the worst thing that could have happened to us. Listen, we never used nuclear weapons, the Russians and the Americans, against each other. Right? They were never used in the Cold War.
And their client states were kept in line?
For more or less, part. More or less, yes. So today's world actually is much more unstable than the world of the Cold War, and so all kinds of bad scenarios are possible. So I'm not actually reassured when I hear, you know, President Bush or President Medvedev in Russia saying this is not a Cold War, this is not a Cold War. Okay, so what is it?
Now, Putin times are good times in Russia economically. You know, the GDP is up and people are earning more and saving and what have you. But there are also military times with Chechnya, with South Ossetia and so on. Why is he doing what he's doing? Is he flexing his muscles and saying, I have hegemony in this region?
If he gets control of Georgia, if Putin gets control of Georgia, then he maintains control of the pipelines that go through Georgia. Which means the BTC pipeline and the Nabucco pipeline that will be coming to operation in 2012. That means that he exerts far more control over European oil and European natural gas resources than he currently does. The prize is control of the European oil market. And that's what he's trying to do.
When you're dealing with a topic of this magnitude, I'm sure we've left out all kinds of things. We only have about 10 seconds for each of you to give us one final thought. Christopher.
One thing that worries me is the way the Russian finances are increasing. What might happen is Medvedev is stuck with the fall of the collapse of the Russian market, which paves the way for Putin to come in as the rescuer 4 years from now.
Sergei.
I believe in Russian evolution. I've seen Russian Revolution. It's a great thing, inspiring, but it ends in huge disappointment. I'd rather see Russia evolve in a progressive democratic direction. I think odds are that it will.
Valber.
I don't think that there is a chance for a new Cold War. The world has changed since the first one, and I do think that Russia is indeed gaining more and more influence in the international system.
I'm Allan Bonner. Bye-bye.